Suppose I offer you a product, unverifiable, untestable, infinite in value but intangible, and most importantly, everyone needs it because the alternative is eternal suffering. If you sell this product, you've established one of the most profitable business models in history. The medieval church did exactly that, and eventually lost everything. Money doesn't speak, history speaks. And history tells us this: the moment salvation is priced, trust begins to crack. The medieval church wasn't just a religious institution. It was a transnational power structure operating across a continent of fragmented kingdoms, weak states, and constant warfare. Kings came and went, borders shifted, but the church remained. It owned land, operated courts, educated elites, and most importantly, claimed moral authority over every soul. But this authority was expensive. The church was building cathedrals to rival heaven. It was financing crusades, managing bureaucratic networks, stretching from Rome to the edges of Christendom. Unlike modern states, it had no tax system backed by police and armies of accountants. It needed revenue streams that seemed legitimate, voluntary, and spiritually justified. So what did the church do? It monetized what it controlled: access to salvation. According to medieval theology, sin created a kind of spiritual debt. Even after forgiveness, punishment remained, either on earth or in the fires of purgatory. This wasn't fringe belief, it was mainstream doctrine, internalized by a population living close to death and taking the afterlife seriously. Initially, indulgences weren't about money. They were tied to pilgrimages, prayers, charitable works. The logic was simple: demonstrate repentance through sacrifice. The church recognizes it spiritually. But over time, something shifted. Acts of devotion became standardized. Sacrifice became measured. And eventually, money replaced effort. Cash was easier than pilgrimage, faster than penance, more scalable than prayer. What began as moral discipline slowly transformed into liquidity. By the late 15th century, indulgences could be purchased outright. Preachers traveled town to town offering reductions in spiritual penalties in exchange for payment. And this wasn't a fixed price. It was a market. Rates varied by sin, status, and urgency. A modest payment, typically equivalent to a day's wages, could promise relief for minor offenses. More serious sins, faster pardons, or indulgences applied to the souls of loved ones already believed to be suffering in purgatory encouraged larger sums. Wealthy buyers were encouraged to give more, not because grace was more expensive, but because they could afford it. In modern terms, this was market segmentation, centuries before the phrase existed. The messaging was clear and emotional. Why suffer in purgatory when relief is possible now? Why leave money sitting when it could help parents, spouses, or children trapped in the afterlife rise? Money doesn't speak. History speaks. Fear became a revenue stream. This system scaled with remarkable efficiency. Indulgences required no enforcement mechanism beyond belief. No need to verify outcomes, no way to audit the afterlife. Trust did all the work. If there's a perfect product, it's one no one can independently test. Behind the curtain, the financial machinery became more complex. Revenue from indulgences was divided among Rome, local bishops, and secular administrators, who were given permission to run the campaigns. Everyone got their cut. Funds flowed into major projects, most famously, the reconstruction of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, a structure meant to symbolize eternal glory, financed by very worldly transactions. And here the system crossed a dangerous line because indulgences stopped feeling like spiritual guidance and started feeling like sales. Pricing became explicit. Marketing became aggressive. Preachers like Johann Tetzel perfected the sales pitch, promising instant relief with rehearsed slogans and emotional certainty. A famous line captured the spirit of the operation. As soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs. Nothing captures eternal mystery quite like a jingle. The people paying into the system weren't elites playing abstract financial games. They were peasants, laborers, families living on the edge. For them, indulgences weren't theology. They were insurance, protection against eternal suffering. When systems sell protection, they gain leverage, but they also assume risk. Because when faith starts behaving like a market, people begin to notice the pricing. They start comparing. They start questioning. They start asking whether grace should fluctuate with revenue. And quietly, almost invisibly at first, trust begins to erode. The church solved its financial problem but created something far more dangerous, a moral imbalance that money couldn't fix. When the church turned salvation into a transaction, it didn't collapse immediately. For a while, the system worked exactly as intended. Money flowed, projects were financed, authority seemed solid. The breaking point didn't come from Rome. It came from the edges, where the system felt most exploitative. In 1517, a German monk named Martin Luther responded not as a revolutionary but as an auditor. His objections were narrow at first. He didn't challenge the existence of sin, purgatory, or faith. He challenged the mechanism. He questioned whether the church had the authority to sell reductions in penalties and whether money could meaningfully substitute for repentance. Luther's 95 Theses weren't a manifesto. They were a list of inconsistencies, a systematic catalog of places where the numbers no longer made sense. Money doesn't speak, history speaks. And history shows us that indulgences weren't unique. They were an early example of something we see often. Institutions that sell relief instead of solving fundamental problems, that profit from fear instead of reducing it, that offer symbolic absolution instead of structural change. When anxiety becomes profitable, there's little incentive to eliminate its source. Today, salvation isn't sold in churches, but assurance is sold everywhere. Compliance fees, convenience premiums, guilt-based consumption, financial products designed not to build real wealth, but to alleviate psychological discomfort. Systems that charge a fee for permission to feel safe, responsible, or protected. The language has changed. The incentives haven't. When institutions price relief, they create dependency. When they create dependency, they gain leverage. And when leverage replaces legitimacy, stability becomes temporary. The Indulgences crisis left us a lesson from the distant past that echoes today. Markets are powerful tools but crude instruments. They allocate resources efficiently but don't understand meaning. When they enter domains based on trust, identity, or morality, they don't just extract value, they reshape behavior. Faith became transactional. Authority became conditional. And when that happened, the system couldn't be repaired with better messaging or tighter enforcement. The damage wasn't procedural, it was philosophical. Power depends more on legitimacy than on force. Money can amplify authority but can't replace it. When institutions trade trust for liquidity, they gain short-term stability and long-term fragility. When belief systems fragment, they don't collapse neatly. They splinter, evolve, and reshape the world in unpredictable ways. Money doesn't speak, history speaks. And history reminds us. The moment salvation is priced, eternity becomes merely a bargain. and bargains can always be questioned. Old money